Thanks everybody, first of all, for coming out, and thanks to the library for allowing me to come out here. I really appreciate the opportunity. My name's Tony Park. I write books set in Africa, in southern Africa. If you have read some of my books, I'd love to have a chat to you later on. And if you haven't read any of my books, I'd especially like to have a chat to you as well later on. See if I can con you into reading one, borrowing one from the library, if not buying one. I thought I'd talk a little bit about Africa, which is where my books are set and it's where my passion is. My wife and I spend half of our lives in Africa these days, literally. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the writing process, about the mechanics of writing a novel, because I've found in my limited experience of talking to people at libraries and various functions, there's usually one or two people in the audience who are perhaps either working on a book themselves or interested in the process. And maybe at the end, just a tiny plug for my new book, Sutherland Library, as well, too, if you don't mind. It's great to see so many people here today, because I've been travelling around promoting this book for about 6 weeks or so. So I've been to lots of libraries and lots of functions. I think my lower record was 4 people at a library in Darwin, but they put on a couple of bottles of wine. So the 4 of us had a really good time anyway. We had an excellent evening, in fact, and it was probably one of the latest library talks I'd done as well, because there's quite a lot of cheese and bickies and wine to get through. But it's great for me just to come out, if they're 4 people or 40, it doesn't matter, because if I'm meeting people that are, hopefully interested in the books or interested in Africa, I'm quite happy to talk about both for as long as I can. Although Silent Predator is my 5th book, my publishers, Pam McMillan, haven't let me out before in the past to go and talk to people or promote the books. Basically, when your first book comes out, my first book was Far Horizon, came out in 2004. I think like a lot of newly published authors, people who are lucky enough to get published, was very keen to go out and promote myself. And they said to me, don't bother, because no one will show up. But I defied them. I went to a bookstore that I knew, a bookstore out at Epping, run by some friends of mine. And 2 people showed up to that one, and they were both related to me, so I don't think that counts. So it's quite good advice, I think. But then I got to the stage with the 5th book where they said, well, why aren't you out there promoting yourself? So then it turns around. So thank you very much for coming along as well, too. In fact, it wasn't until my 4th book, Safari, came out last year, that I'd ever in fact seen anybody who wasn't a blood relative or a close friend of mine actually holding a copy of one of my books as well. So it was quite an interesting experience. I was in the city in Pitt Street at a large bookstore there. I won't say which one it is, but Safari had just come out. It was on the new releases shelves near the front of the bookshop. And I just happened to be in this bookstore this day, and I just happened to be standing near the new releases shelves, and I picked up another book that I was reading, or pretending to read, because I wouldn't want you to think we're all egotistical, big-headed people. But I was just keeping a bit of an eye on how things were going on the new releases shelves. And I thought, I wonder what I'd do. I mean, I wonder what I would say, or if I should say anything, if somebody ever actually did go up and pick up one of my books, a stranger. And if I did go up to them, what would I say? Well, that's a lie, for a start, because I'd had quite a few sleepless nights thinking about exactly what I would say. So I had this carefully rehearsed speech, and I had my approach all rehearsed. And I'm in this bookstore, and lo and behold, this lady walks up to the new releases shelf. This elderly lady walks up, she picks up a copy of Safari, and she turns it over in her hands and has a bit of a look at it. And I thought, oh, geez, what'll I do? The old heart started beating a little bit faster. I thought, I've got my approach worked out. So I sidled up to her and said, if you buy that, I'll sign it for you. And she jumped away from me like this, like I was some kind of serial killer or something like that. And she looked at me. And I said, no, I wrote this book. She said, really? Yeah. So I opened up the back cover, which has got a photo of me, and she had a look at the photo, and she had a look at me, and I said, well, I'm a little bit older, and I'm a little bit greyer, and I'm a little bit fatter, and I'm a little bit thinner on top, but it is me. And so she worked out, she believed me. She said, it is you. And I said to her, who's the book for? And she said, oh, it's for a gentleman friend of mine. He likes books about Africa. I said, he'll love this. He'll love this. And she says, he likes Wilbur Smith books. I said, he'll like that. He'll like this one as well, too. There's only 2 differences between me and Wilbur Smith. That's about 30 books and about $30 million. Other than that, we do write books about Africa. I think maybe the only other similarity. But she said to me, I think I'll buy that. And so we walked arm in arm towards the cash register. I may have been a bit of a pork eating sort of moment happening as we walked along there. But I was feeling quite pleased with myself, to be quite honest, at this stage. And around the stack of shelves came a shop assistant, this young girl with a big stack of books in her hand. And on the top of the stack was a big thick book called Shantaran by a guy called Gregory David Roberts, also published by Macmillan, former heroin addict and Australia's Most Wanted. And she'd obviously been talking to the lady, to my new friend. And she said, I found some books your friend will like. And my new friend says, I'm going to buy this book, Safari by Tony Park. And the shop assistant said, no, this is much better. She said, and my new friend said, this young man wrote that book. Now, I don't know if you've ever actually seen the coloured rain from someone's face, but it's quite an amazing thing to watch as it happens. And this poor girl looked at me and she said, I'm terribly sorry. I said, it's okay. It's all right. And the manager of the shop came up to me after and says, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Park, about that. How'd you like to sign 20 copies of your book? I said, I'd love to, because I know if I sign them, you can't send them back to the publisher if you don't sell them. So it all worked out okay. But it was a new experience for me. But seriously, I mean, travelling around on this last sort of 4 or 5 weeks has been great for me to get out and meet people. And what I've found is I really, really enjoy it. So I will be around to have a chat afterwards and a cup of coffee. If you do want to stick around and have a chat, I'll be more than happy to do so. As I said at the start, all the books are set in Africa, and my wife Nicola and I are very passionate about the continent itself. People have asked me in the past if I set out originally to write books in Africa. No, I didn't, but a couple of things happened in my life to start setting me on the course that I was on. Nicola and I first went to South Africa in 1995, and we went on a holiday. And I think we essentially went just to get a tick in a box. We backpacked around. We'd done quite a lot of travelling when we were younger. We'd travelled around Asia, and we travelled around Europe, and we thought, well, now we'll go to Africa. Naive people, we thought, we'll just do Africa. We'll give ourselves about 3 weeks to do it. So I was working for the state government at the time, and I was quite immersed in my job. I'd worked as a journalist on the Leader, as I said before earlier, and then I went from there to work for the state government. And pretty focused on my job at the time, and I didn't really pay a lot of attention to the holiday and the planning. So Nicola, my wife, is very organised. So she did all the planning. And I literally finished work on a Friday, and we went off to the airport on the Saturday, and I said, well, we're going to Africa, right? She said, yes. She said, South Africa. Yeah. I said, where do we go? Like, where do we land? She said, we land in Johannesburg. And I said, isn't that dangerous? And she said, oh, you'll be all right. Don't worry. I said, how do we get around? Are we getting a bus or a train or something? And she said, no, we're going to drive. And I thought, oh, okay. So I have visions of a fully kitted out 4-wheel drive, a big tent and trailer and all this kind of stuff. I said, what are we getting? And she said, a Corolla. And I thought, okay. So we pick up this Corolla in Johannesburg, most dangerous city in the world. And what do we do then? Oh, we drive out into the bush and we go looking for lions and elephants and rhinos. And I said, are you mad? She said, no, I've done a bit of research. Trust me, it'll be fine. I think like a lot of people, I had a lot of misconceptions, a lot of preconceptions about what Africa, or South Africa in particular, would be like. I didn't expect, for example, to come out of what even then was a relatively modern airport and get onto a motorway standard road and drive at 120 kilometres an hour minimum speed out towards the national park. And I didn't expect the Kruger National Park, which was the first place we really went to be as well set up as it was. I didn't expect the infrastructure to be as good. I didn't really expect things to run as smoothly as they did. And nor, I think, did I really expect that we would have such incredibly memorable experiences with the local wildlife that we did. It was all very different and all a bit bigger than what I expected. We travelled through the Kruger National Park in our little rented Corolla up into Zimbabwe, which back in 1995 was still certainly not a model democracy, but a very prosperous country at the time. Sad to say, we've seen that country over the last 13 years, we've been back every year since then, deteriorate, to go from being a relatively prosperous country, quite a booming tourism and rural economy, to being just about dead at the moment. It's a very sad thing to have witnessed. But from there, we went into Botswana and we travelled on a circuit back down into South Africa. And by the end of that 3-week trip, something had happened to us. I don't know whether we'd breathed something in. I don't know whether we'd drunk something. I don't know whether we'd been bitten by something, but we were hooked, well and truly. And it was a novel experience for us because, as I said, we travelled around large parts of the world. But there was something about this continent and the small, relatively small part of it that we had seen in that first trip, that we became addicted to. And that's the only way I can describe it, as an addiction that took hold of our lives. It began to consume increasing amounts of our money, increasing amounts of our time. The more we got of it, the more we found we wanted. As I said, we've been back every year since then for increasing amounts of time, to the extent where we now spend 6 months of every year travelling around Africa, mostly Southern Africa. But it's hard, even though it's my job, for me to put my finger on and to describe what it is about a place that draws you back time and time again. If anyone's been, or if anyone's lived in Africa in the past, you may have an inkling about what I'm talking about. If you haven't, be very careful if you do go, because it might change your life. I think it's about experiences. I think it's different to going to, say, a city or a particular place or a monument somewhere in the world. You know, I mean, if you're lucky enough to go to Paris and you go and see the Eiffel Tower, it is spectacular. It's a very impressive bit of steel, but it's still going to be the same every time you keep going back. That's probably glossing over Paris a little bit too much. But if you go to Africa, you can drive the same stretch of road, go to the same country time and time and time again, and it'll be a different experience every time you go back. Sometimes a good experience, sometimes not so good an experience. As I said before, it seems to me that everything is magnified in Africa. The good things that you see tend to be that much more vivid than anywhere else in the world. You know, spectacular sunrises and the spectacular sunsets, the bush, the sweeping plains, the wildlife experiences seem to me, anyway, personally, to be, say, 100 times bigger and more vivid and more memorable than any other similar type of experiences that I've had anywhere else in the world. That might be romanticising a little bit, but I think it goes for the people that I meet. I mean, the characters and the fascinating people and the stories that they have are almost beyond belief. I mean, I've had discussions with people that I've met, safari guides, rangers, conservationists, and the stories they've told me I couldn't put into fiction because no one would believe me. They've been so outrageous, so incredibly mind-blowing that I would have a hard time convincing anybody that such a thing would be possible. But if you've ever spent any time in Africa, or if you've ever picked up a newspaper or turned on the TV lately, you'll know that it's not all rosy. You can't go to Africa and just be dazzled by the good things. You can't travel through the continent and not become aware of the problems and issues such as crime, which I mentioned before, corruption, political mismanagement, health issues such as HIV/AIDS. These things all exist to varying forms, you know, around the world. But it seems, because it quite often is, that these problems are 100 times worse in Africa. The magnitude of the tragedy that you come across, and the incredibly sad stories that you come across do affect you as well, certainly affect me as well. So I don't think that one can be blind to the problem. So I don't see myself, and hopefully I'm not an apologist for Africa or its problems, but I do try and touch on both the good and the bad in the books. As I said before, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the writing process and come back to Africa during that as well too. I didn't set out to write books in Africa, but I knew I always wanted to write a book. This is one thing that I always wanted to do, to write fiction. I was a little kid. I grew up in Campbelltown out in the western suburbs. I was talking to the library staff before. I said I think it was used as sort of cheap childcare by my parents when I was a bit younger, because I do remember spending most afternoons after school in our local library, and because there was nothing much else to do. So I started reading a lot. And I remember clearly being in the local library, looking around, surrounded by all these rather old, dusty books around me, thinking, somebody's writing all these books. It must be somebody's job to write a book. And I thought, wouldn't that be the coolest thing in the world if that could be my job, to write a book? So I knew from a very early age that this was something I was very passionate about. I couldn't add up, and I was no good at science, so there's probably not much else that I was going to be able to do with my life anyway. Through my early career choices, or not even choices, the jobs I stumbled into seemed to be heading me in the right direction. I worked as a journalist on local papers, including the St George Leader, and I was lucky enough to have very good teachers there, and I was lucky enough to learn the basic skills of communicating by words. I don't think everything I learned as a journalist has helped me to write fiction. Some things I've had to unlearn along the way. Couple of things I think that did help me were just being taught how to observe, how to listen to people, how to look around and convey, often very, very impressive or sometimes very tragic events into words, get across emotions in that way. Found dialogue relatively easy in fiction because I was used to putting words in people's mouths for a number of years as well. But you do need to develop an ear for how people speak as well. So even when I was working as a journo, I thought, yes, I still really want to write a book. But I fell into other jobs. I worked for the government for a while as a press secretary, into private sector public relations. And I had no complaints. I was doing okay, and my professional work was doing well, and I found myself second in charge of a public relations company in Sydney. And it was a good job, make no mistake about it, but I knew that what I really wanted to do was write. And after a couple of false starts over the years, I'd also worked out that for me, the biggest challenge to writing a book or finishing a book was time and space. That was having enough time and enough space to be able to write. I do know other writers who write for Macmillan who become friends of mine who can get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and write for 2 hours and go to work and do a full day's work. I know other people that can do a full day's work and come home and write into the night. I'm way too lazy for that. I couldn't possibly do that. I worked out I didn't have the self-discipline to do it. So I thought I'd really need to make a break. And I got to the stage in about 1997 where I thought, well, this is it. I'm going to take 6 months off. I'm going to save up some money, which I did in advance. And Nicola was supportive of me, which was great. And I thought, I'm going to write a book. And I thought, well, if I leave work, forget about that. If I now do the same amount of work that I was doing, but devote my energy, if I work really hard on a book, I could be able to knock it over in about 2 or 3 months. I thought if I write from 9 o'clock till 5 o'clock each day and I can produce this many words, and that didn't work either. I also found myself getting quite a bit of freelance writing work from people who I'd worked with in the past, most of whom I think thought I'd been sacked, because nobody thought that I really would have been stupid enough to leave my job and go and spend 6 months trying to write a book. You don't find people terribly supportive, I find, apart from immediate family members. I had quite a few people who told me that everyone's got a book in them and that's where they should stay. And a lot of people just told me I was an idiot flat out. But I didn't get a lot of work done. I didn't get a lot of writing done because I was doing other related sort of freelance writing jobs and public relations jobs. But as I've mentioned, Nicola and I had this growing addiction to Africa, and that had started in 1995. So by 1998, I had to make another decision. I had to make a decision now to change my life yet again, to give up that kind of growing freelance type work that I was doing and to really make a break. And Nicola was ready for a holiday and things have been going okay, so we decided to pack up and go overseas for about 7 months. And of that time, we decided to spend about 4 months in Africa. I had a laptop, and I suddenly found myself with no more excuses, no more reasons not to get into a book, start writing a book and finish it. I found myself with time. We were travelling around in an old Land Rover that we bought that year in 1998. I had a laptop and space. I had room to think, if you know what I mean. It's not partly a physical thing, but it's also a mind thing, mind space thing. Having the time to collect my thoughts each day before I then sat down to write them. I find I need this. And inspiration. And inspiration's a funny word because certainly Africa is very inspiring in terms of its beauty. It can be very uplifting. In terms of finding ideas for stories, it's absolute gold. I mean, you've only got to open a paper in Africa or strike up a conversation with someone and you come up with the ideas for about 10 different books. So I had enough inspiration in terms of story ideas. I had amazing, spectacular landscapes. And unfortunately, I was becoming more and more aware of the continent's problems. I was learning more as we travelled, warts and all, about how bad things could be in that particular part of the world. But as a writer, you need inspiration even from negative things. As I said, I don't want to be an apologist. I don't want to just write about pretty sunrises and pretty sunsets. But nor do I want my books to be dragged down into being completely doom and gloom. Because if you haven't read them, they are all mainstream thrillers set basically in contemporary Africa. There's one historical one. So the story has to be paramount. This is what they tell you when you're writing fiction. The story has to be the main thing. So what I try and do in the writing is walk a fairly tight rope, a fairly fine line between not becoming too kind of goggle-eyed about the beauty of the continent and not becoming too morose or too dragged down by the problems. But I think what I try and do, what I aim to do, is to have the events, good and bad in Africa, the locations as spectacular as they are, have an effect or an impact on my characters in hopefully a similar way that they would to people in real life. The lead characters in all of my books so far have been people who are discovering Africa for the first time. I use that device because I'm not from Africa and I don't pretend to have had any family connections there. And also because I like recapturing the wonder and the amazement of experiencing the continent for the first time. So I've done that deliberately. I've tried to show Africa through a stranger's eyes each time. I don't think it hurts to have a stranger's eyes or a fresh set of eyes on any country, any location where you're writing. So that's the inspiration side of things. The mechanics of how I write on that first trip, again, no more excuses. I was travelling around some very impressive parts of the continent, and I was travelling a fairly well-trodden tourist path through some spectacular locations again, such as the Kruger Park, parts of Mozambique, Victoria Falls. So I thought, well, I'll write a book set on a tour truck, which is what I did. So the first book is about a tour group that works its way through Africa, and various things happen to them along the way. Because I found that if I fell back on my journalistic training, I could look around, and what worked for me was looking around and actually drawing inspiration from the places that I was visiting at the time that I was visiting. So what I do in my books to a certain extent is I think I report. I try as far as possible to have the story follow wherever I am at the time. It's sort of cheating a little bit. You know, it's like doing research simply by waking up and looking around you. And again, when you're looking for inspiration, if I'm out in the bush, and some of the books have got quite a strong wildlife theme, it's very hard not to be inspired or motivated to work when you're sitting at a desk, a fold-up table, as I sometimes do outside my tent, and herd elephants walks past on the other side of the fence. It's very hard not to be moved by that. The real challenge, of course, is being able to capture those emotions quickly and put them in the book. But that's what you'll see in a lot of my writing. It's me writing on location. That means that I don't have a plot when I start off. One of the things I read in books about how to write before I started writing was that you should have a plot. You should know exactly what's going to happen from chapter 1 through to chapter 30. You should know what all the action is. You should know who the characters are. Indeed, you should even have little profile sheets on all the characters so that they're consistent throughout the book. And I couldn't do that. I tried doing that. I could never think up a story. I could never think up a story in advance. I don't have a plot. My wife thinks I've lost the plot, but in fact I never had one at all in the start. But I do rely on her because the way I write is almost like reading a book very slowly. I basically make the story up as I go along, or rather I let it tell itself as it goes along. I use it to keep myself entertained. I do find writing very enjoyable. I look forward to doing it. And I like the story to tell itself to me as I go along, just let it unfold. So I like to be surprised. Nicola has a very interesting way of reading books generally. She's very good at spotting the end of a book within the first couple of pages. So she'll read the first couple of pages and she'll think that she knows how it's going to end. So then she flicks to the end of the book and reads the last page. And I've caught her doing this many times and it drives me crazy. And then if she thinks it's worth reading, she'll read the middle bit. I won't let her read my books like that. I'll give it to her a page at a time if I have to. Or certainly leave off the ending. So my aim in life, but only in matters literary, is to fool my wife. And I figure that if I can fool my wife, I think I've done an okay job. If I can make her cry, if I can move her to emotions, I think I've done a good job. Again, only in matters literary. And also if I can write what's colloquially known as or euphemistically known, I should say, as a romance scene without my wife saying, try again, or could do better, then hopefully I'm on the right track as well too. So I enjoy the process. She's a very good first editor of my book because unlike me, she does have a very logical mind and she's very good at matters of continuity. So she's good at pointing out to me characters who've started off a book at 6 foot with blonde hair and blue eyes and ended up at 5'8" with brown hair and red eyes or some blue eyes. So the continuity thing is very important as well too. So she reads the book, my mother reads the book, my mother-in-law reads the book. They both have a lot of input on the romance scenes, and then it goes to the publishers, and they also have a lot of input as well too. But it's an enjoyable process and one that I really do look forward to getting started again. I'm actually going back to Africa next week for 6 months, and I'll be starting work on a 7th book because my 6th one has been accepted. So I'm looking forward to getting back there. The 5th book, Silent Predator, again is set in contemporary southern Africa, South Africa and Mozambique mostly, and a little bit of Malawi. It starts in a real place called Tinga Private Game Lodge. And at the risk of sounding overly commercial, if you do buy or read the book from the library, you can win a $20,000 luxury safari to Africa, including a stay at this real place, Tingha Private Game Lodge. The action involves a police protection officer. They don't like being called bodyguards, as I found out in my research, but a British guy who travels to Africa with a British government minister who he's escorting and protecting, and they go over there for trade talks. And our bodyguard wakes up one morning to find the guy he's supposed to be looking after has disappeared. So it's a chase across the Kruger National Park, across through the bush into the wilds of Mozambique, and eventually to the Indian Ocean coast of that country, which is quite spectacular, where our hero, Detective Sergeant Tom Fury, and his tall, attractive, blonde-haired female police counterpart from the South African Police Service have to go in search of the missing politician who's been abducted. Again, what I've tried to do with this book as the others is you can't write a story, a contemporary police story set in South Africa and not mention the terrible crime problems over there at the moment. You can't set a book in Southern Africa and not talk about political issues. So I've tried to include those, but I've also tried to show the reader what I believe is one of, if not the most beautiful places in the world, and certainly in Africa, and that's the bushland through the Kruger National Park and the coast of Mozambique. So there's a bit of the good, a bit of the bad. I was on location when I wrote all that book, same as the others. So writing it was a very enjoyable experience for me, not just in letting the story tell itself to me, but also in visiting all the places in there. I'll probably wrap up just by saying that I find Africa an incredibly inspirational place. If you have been there, you probably know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I would seriously consider, I'd certainly recommend anybody going over there anytime. I hope you enjoy Africa, and I hope if you get the chance, you might enjoy one of my books. So thank you for your time. Thank you. And if anyone's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, apart from where we leave our vehicle, which was with some friends in Zimbabwe, who are still amazingly, hanging in there at the moment. We do move around all the time. Yeah, we'll tend to set up the tent for about 4 weeks at a time. We do camp for about 90% of the time we're over there. Sometimes we'll stay in roofed accommodation, but that's a special treat. One of the things is money reasons as well too. If we're travelling on the road for 6 months, we want to keep the costs down. But we might set up camp for say 4 or 5 weeks at a time when I do the writing, and pass through the cities enough to gather research material, enough to get a feel for what's going on. But yeah, I'd say a good 90% of our time spent camping in the bush, where it's where I do the writing. Yeah. We've survived okay. Had a couple of nasty scares. Had lions around the tent one night, which was very, very scary up in the Zambezi Valley. A truly terrifying moment. You know how they say, you've probably heard people say, well, if you come across lions, you shouldn't run. You're supposed to stay still. There's actually a book written about that. You're supposed to stay, because a lion's you hear all the theories, a lion's like a house cat. It likes to pounce on things and hunts by sight and sound. And if you're like a little lizard, if you stay still, or like a little mouse, like a smart mouse and stay still, it'll get bored with you eventually. Great theory. Terrific theory. You find yourself in a tent about this big with a broken door held together with sticky tape to keep the mosquitoes out. And you hear two things walk around outside go. I said to my wife, look, I know the theory, but if we run really quickly, we can make it to the Land Rover and we can get in there. And she said, you something idiot. She said you wouldn't make it 5 feet. And I wouldn't have. But believe me, the natural instinct is not to stay still and quiet. To run as fast as you possibly can. We've been really lucky. I think because of the way we travel now, because we're not just flying in and flying out, we travel slowly. We have a very old Land Rover that lots of people take pity on. So we do meet a lot of people through our travels, and having the luxury of spending a long time there, we've made some very good friends there. Black and white, different countries, different cultures, and I'm drawing, I think, more inspiration as I go on for characters in terms of their stories, their particular stories, not just stories based on other people's experiences of Africa. I think it's the same as with the landscape. I mean, the characters we've met are just out of this world. I mean, their stories are so much bigger and more vivid. As I said, the challenge is to try, and if you're going to draw on that for inspiration, is to make it believable. Safari is kicks off with a professional hunter who's out with one of his clients, and they come across some poachers and get involved in a gun battle. I don't want you to think this happens every day, but it doesn't, but I had heard of it happening. And it actually involved a safari guide, a guy by the name of Leon Varley, who wasn't out escorting hunters, but just tourists. And he came across some poachers and got involved in a gun battle. It was up in the wilds of Zimbabwe. As I said, it doesn't happen every day. But I was in a camp and I met this guy and we just struck up a conversation. He says, I'm Tony. He says, I'm Leon. I said, you're not Leon Varley, are you? He said, yes. I said, did you really kill a poacher? He said, yeah, I shot two. I only killed one. And I said, wow, what was that like? And he said, oh, it was a bit scary. He says, the guy that I didn't kill, that was a bit of a pain because I had to carry him out of the bush. But, there's people with incredible stories. I think the other thing in terms of inspiration that I didn't touch on is that when you go back to a country like Zimbabwe, and I'll be back there next month, I know things are just worse, even worse than they were 6 months ago when I was there now. One thing that I do find inspiring in a truly uplifting way is the way that people deal with adversity in Africa, the way they're able to get on with their lives. Or I think in another aspect that we've had some exposure to here in Australia, but probably take for granted, is just what a challenge it is and what a big thing it is to have to leave your country and set up somewhere else on the other side of the world. I've got a lot of friends who I've met through the books who are Zimbabweans or South Africans that have moved over here either because of some trauma that they've suffered or because they've been kicked out of their homes in the case of the Zimbabweans. And I think as Aussies, we take it for granted that everyone wants to come and live in Australia because it's a great place. And yeah, why wouldn't you come over here? But if you turn it around and think about the courage and determination it must take to make a conscious decision or to have this thrust upon you and to relocate your entire family somewhere else and start again, perhaps at an advanced stage in your life. It's just something that I don't know that most of us Aussies would be able to carry off if we found ourselves in the same situation. So you do come across great stories of strength and great stories of faith and stories of dedication in the face of adversity. That's something I've picked up from the people for sure. A real toughness, I think, a mental and physical and spiritual toughness of people over there. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. There's a friendliness and a kindness, yeah. And I think it's very hard to generalise, but I think I find it's probably almost like going to an ideal of a country sort of town sometimes, where people are happy to help strangers and people are quite friendly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think you've got to be careful where you go, and you've got to be careful how you interact with people wherever you travel as well too, and just keep your senses about you as well too. I think and keep an eye on things. Yeah. No, they're not. No, and you could read any of them as standalone books. They're not a sort of ongoing family thing like this other chap that writes books about Africa. Because I asked my publishers, that at the start. I said, should I keep the same characters going on? And they said no, because if people hate the first one, they won't buy any more of the others. So, but I've liked that as well. I've liked having the flexibility to change locations and even times, because African Sky, the third one, is set in the Second World War, but the other four are all contemporary. So I've liked the freedom to be able to move around and change locations and people. Yeah. Oh, no, I don't. No. Oh, number two is rubbish. No, no, I don't. No, honestly, because to me, quite honestly, once I've written the story, or once it's left my mind, it's over, and I just immerse myself in it, and I love each of them as I'm writing. But I'll tell you, as soon as I finish, I can't wait to start on the next one. I really can't. Sorry, yeah. No, not at all. I've it just happens. I mean, sometimes the ending can be the hardest thing. I don't find getting started hard, but like for example, next week I'm going to start the seventh one. I've got one character in mind, and I know I want to set it in Namibia because I haven't set a book in Namibia simply for that. And it's a fascinating country with lots of interesting stories, and I know what her job is, but that's as far as I've got. So I'm just going to let it unfold as I go. It's very hard to describe, but it is true. I found it works for me. But I think that's also, as I said, about having the space, having enough time. When I'm driving around looking at animals, we'll spend a typical day getting up early and going off on a game drive in our Land Rover looking at wildlife. All that time, as well as looking around me and taking pictures and things, I've got empty time in my head where the people start talking to me in my head, where the characters start taking form. And sometimes it's a rush for me to get back to the campsite and actually write down all these conversations that have been going on in my head. So it does unfold, yeah. And I think I like the ending to surprise me. And as I said, I especially like the ending to surprise Nicola, my wife, as well, too. So the more different it can be, the more fun I get out of it as well. Because it's, yeah, I mean, and Silent Predator, I wrote the book substantially, except for the last 20 pages when I was away on my last trip. But I didn't finish it off until about a month after I got home because I couldn't think of how to end it. But then one night, after a couple of glasses of red wine and a couple of beers, it came to me, and I raced off and wrote the last 20 pages at home in the flat. But that's the only time I've done that. So. It's about 130,000 words, and I've never been told to stick to that. For me, I've got 6 months realistically, I've got 6 months of the year to write a book. So that's a fair bit of work in 6 months. One day if I could write a 1,000-page Ken Follett type book or something like that, that'd be great. But it's a bit of a time thing for me as well. But I find that's a good space to tell a story. Yeah. Oh, it's English. The gentleman was just asking about the languages in Africa, and it's generally English-speaking where we are in the southern part, although Namibia is going to be quite a bit of German spoken there. I've tried to pick up some African languages, a little bit of that, but the difficulty with that is that, you can't think of Africa as in any way a sort of homogenous place. You've got so many different cultures and so many different tribal affiliations and different cultural backgrounds that the kudos you might get by addressing, say, a local African person in their language will be very quickly undone if you get it wrong. If you address someone from a rival tribe in the wrong language, you probably cause much more offence than you possibly could have done if you'd spoken English to them. But English, yeah, Southern Africa is generally English, so it's pretty easy to get around. Sorry, was there somebody? What's that? That's right. Yeah. Oh, I just went to them with the first book. I had a very, very, very fortunate start, a very lucky start, is that I'd written my book set in contemporary Africa. I sent it in to them simply because I knew I didn't have a connection there, but I knew the name Macmillan because it had been mentioned to me. A friend of my mum's, her daughter worked there, and I thought, well, I'll try them first. So I just shot it off to them, and they happened to be looking for a book set in Africa, a contemporary fiction book. So that was the closest I got to having it in there. They're a great publisher, and I must give them a big plug because they're a big supporter of Australian mainstream fiction, mass market fiction. So there's a lot of really good other Macmillan authors like Peter Watt, Di Blacklock, David Rowlands. We're all writing, mass market mainstream type fiction, and Macmillan is putting time and money into us, which is good, instead of just taking the easy option and just taking whatever comes from overseas. So I thank them for that, that's for sure. Yeah. Yeah, very well, thanks. Yeah, the lady was just asking if I'd marketed the books in Africa. Macmillan distributes them to South Africa, and my sales have been increasing with each book over there. And one of the best things I find I can get is when I get people from South Africa who've emailed me and say they like my books. I think, wow, if I can crack that, I'm very happy. I find lots of similarities, cultural similarities between the readers there and here, and a lot of shared experiences as well. I also find the books set in Australia, like Peter Watt's books. I don't know if you've ever read any of those sort of outbacky type things. They're quite popular in Africa, and the late Beverly Harper sells exceptionally well still in Africa as well, in Southern Africa. So yeah, I've been very fortunate with that and very happy about that. Yeah. No, I don't actually. I don't ever go back. I never stop. Once I start, I don't stop until the end. And I do that deliberately because I know if I kept rereading as I went, I would never finish. There's a very good book called On Writing by Stephen King, if anyone is interested in the writing process, about writing fiction. I love it because it's the only book I've ever found that says what I'm doing is okay. And he basically says, just go for it and get it out of your system. Don't worry about plot or any of that kind of stuff. But then you've got a fair bit of work to do in the first draft. You've got to go back and straighten things out. The other thing he says is each day finish mid-chapter, mid-sentence, mid-paragraph, and there's no excuse for not starting the next day. And I find that to be very good advice. Whenever I've stopped at the end of a chapter, I've sometimes forced myself to go a little bit further into the next chapter because there's nothing worse than starting and a blank space, having to try and work out exactly where you were. But if you stop mid-sentence, no excuses, straight into it next day. Great, and I'll be happy to stick around and have a chat to people afterwards. Thank you. And thanks for coming along. Thank you. Thanks very much. Does everybody hate having their picture on camera or on a video? Always sound odd as well.